The quarterback position, no SEC players, no big surprise. First to fourth teams, Deshaun Watson, Clemson, Baker Mayfield, Oklahoma, J.T. Barrett, Ohio State, Greg Ward, Houston. The running back position, very nicely represented by Leonard Fournette on the first team along with Dalvin Cook. We've got Jalen Hurd showing up. And also at the athlete position, per se, you've got Nick Chubb on the fourth team, Christian McCaffrey, the second Heisman ballot nominee at number one. So, Chad, what stands out to you on this one?
Man, it really, when I'm looking at it, one, I like the fact that Jalen Hurd is getting some attention here, albeit it's on the fourth team. I'd kind of like to see, I think he could be ranked better when I'm looking at this group of running backs. And why do we even have an AP position? Can we not just call it, third running back, because that's really what it is here at this point? I mean, I think Christian McCaffrey, the number one spot is completely solid in my opinion. I think this guy, honestly, is one of the more underrated players in the country. We saw that last year. Leonard Fournette at the number one spot in the running back, not really shocked there. A guy that has put up a slew of touchdowns this last season. Will probably do so again this season if LSU has any semblance of a passing attack. And then you turn around and you look at Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb at the fourth spot is actually really kind of interesting to me because, Stephen Lasson, who wrote the piece, talks about that this is projections in 2016 that he's talking about, more or less about how he thinks they're going to do. And maybe Nick Chubb doesn't do as well as he thinks he does under this first year with Kirby Smart, so maybe I'm reading into that a little much, but still I think that's kind of interesting considering the season that he had up until that injury that he suffered in Knoxville, Tennessee. So I think this is maybe that's speaking to that, as far as how that role is going to turn for him with Sonny Michel and him sharing the carries there. But and of course, no quarterback out of the SEC. This year you've got two guys, Dobbs and Kelly, pretty much leading the way. And, for me, I'm actually kind of surprised that Kelly didn't get some type of naming in here because you got to figure this year he's probably going to shatter some of Ole Miss's passing records. Yeah, I think if I'm looking at this and having to look at these guys, I mean, what do you base your criteria on? Statistics? Are you looking at certain big game performances and things of that nature? And if you are, then maybe that's where you start to separate. Because I think once you start looking at the national scope, and you're looking at all these players from all these Power 5 teams, you got to figure there's got to be some type of structure because you're looking and nitpicking at these guys. So for me, I'd probably have to look at stats and key games, championship games, big time conference games, rival games, and start looking at how they performed to tell me about how these guys did overall during the season.
David, your thoughts about what we've covered here at quarterback and running back?
I agree with Chad. I thought Chad Kelly would probably maybe get that fourth team, but I don't have a problem with Greg Ward being there. And maybe third team with J.T. Barrett as well. But, seeing what, he's potential under Urban Meyer, and that's what the author here is based on potential. I just think, I have no problem with that. Barrett, if Ohio State and Meyer can get those ducks in a row there and kind of get over the little quarterback hump they had last year, I see no reason why J.T. Barrett is not probably one of the four best quarterbacks in the nation. Really surprised with Nick Chubb. If this is based on projection, maybe he sees Chubb maybe misses some time from the injury, or maybe he just sees Nick Chubb not really coming back from the injury full go. It was a nasty injury, we all know. It may take some time to get over it. But if you're asking me right now, Nick Chubb's probably a top 3, 4, 5 running back to me. So I guess this kind of reflects that in a way, but I would have Nick Chubb a good bit higher. I think he's better than Wayne Gallman, Artavis Scott from Clemson, better than those guys if you want to move him up on the all-purpose list there. Nick Chubb, that's probably the biggest surprise for me. I would have Nick Chubb a little higher. Dalvin Cook, Leonard Fournette, the first two. I'm one of the few rare people I think I like Dalvin Cook a little more than Leonard Fournette. I do get to see him a little bit more here in Florida, and I followed his recruiting and stuff. But I just think overall he's a little bit more electric playmaker than Leonard Fournette. All-around game is probably just a tad bit better. Leonard Fournette's probably a hair bit better running back, but overall, I like Dalvin Cook just a little bit better.
You know, Mike, we're going to point to you to give a comment on Jalen Hurd, but what catches your eye across the board at running back and quarterback?
Well, I don't think the quarterback position is very surprising. If you look at the SEC, it's definitely a conference where the defense dominates. And if you look at the breakdown of the Athlon All-American team, the SEC has more guys on the defense on every team than they have on the offense. First team, second team, third team, fourth team. I have no issue with any of those four quarterbacks being ahead of Chad Kelly or especially Josh Dobbs. I think Chad Kelly will have to earn the All-American position this year based on his body of work. If you look at the top three, Watson, Mayfield, and Barrett, they all took their teams to either the playoffs or just short of the playoffs. Ole Miss really wasn't in contention there at the end of the season. And Greg Ward, I think, is a legitimate fourth-team quarterback there. As far as running back, I will say to Chad's point, I'm kind of okay with the all-purpose position. I think what the all-purpose position reflects is the diversity of offenses in college football today. You got slot receivers. I don't know a single team except for Georgia Tech, Navy, and Army that has three running backs on the field at one time. So I think the all-purpose position on an All-American team not only is justified, but I think it's a good thing because it reflects the diversity of the offenses in college ball, and it allows the voting organization, whether it's Athlon or AP or another organization, to really reward those guys who deserve it but might not fit in based on the system that they play in. As far as Jalen Hurd, I think Jalen Hurd is deserving of fourth-team offense. Could you put him in the third team? I think you can make an argument. Here's the thing that I think hurts Jalen Hurd. Of the 8, 9, 10, if you include McCaffrey and Chubb and Scott. So of the 11 guys there in the running back, the 11 running backs there, Jalen Hurd splits his time with splits his carries more than any of those other 10 guys. I don't have the stats with me, but I'd be willing to lay down quite a bit of money that says he has the lowest percentage of his team's carries of all 11 of those guys. That's probably why he's fourth team and no higher.
Well, I'm going to back that up. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I just scanned it myself, and the rest of those guys get the bulk of their team's carries, no question. Scott and Nelson are receivers, but the other guys that you mentioned, the other 10, are the main guy, more so than Chubb versus what Sony Michel gets at Georgia. I will speak to the quarterback situation in regards to J.T. Barrett was not one of the four best quarterbacks in the country last year in terms of production because he didn't even win the job, and then he gained the job at about game 10 or 11, and he may have been one of the best quarterbacks in the country by the end of the season based on what he did against Michigan and Notre Dame. 2 years ago, he set a Big Ten touchdown record. He was an exceptional quarterback. Obviously, the projection is, hey, he's got the gig from start to finish. He's going to produce. Chad Kelly, 4,000-yard season. I've seen him on a lot of top 3 lists, third-team All-America type status, so he's certainly in that argument. And we would have to have the writers here to have them determine for us who that fifth guy, sixth guy were and how close they were to getting into the discussion there. The only issue with playing devil's advocate on the AP position there, Mike, is you get flagged for having a 12th man on the field. So you can't hit the field with this All-American team on offense because they're going to flag you. But, man, that guy, Calvin Ridley, I've already started to talk, guys, about Calvin Ridley possibly being a dark horse for the Heisman Trophy this year. He's not playing in some kind of West Coast offense or a Mountain West type offense at a like we see at San Diego State or somewhere where they're going to throw the ball all over the field to have just ridiculous statistics. But I think he could have Amari Cooper type stats and then obviously have the huge, ridiculous catches, meaningful catches in huge games. I think Calvin Ridley could just, I wouldn't want to call it a breakout year, maybe from star player to superstardom. Your thoughts, Mike, we'll start with you on the wide receiver position. And beyond that, where we see Ridley as a first-team All-American player at wide receiver out of Alabama. Let's see, we got Christian Kirk, who had a huge freshman campaign out of Texas A&M on the second team at tight end. O.J. Howard, hey, if he does what he did in the national championship game, which of course he's not going to week, but hey, he might be the best tight end in the country, regardless of what the stats say.
Mark, I completely agree with your assessment of Calvin Ridley. He's not going to put up the numbers that some of those guys are going to put up, particularly Kirk or probably Schuster, but he's going to have the most important catches of anybody out there. If Alabama's to get back, they're going to have to incorporate their receiving game. But I'm actually more impressed with O.J. Howard. He come into last season with a lot of expectations. He's fourth team, and I'm going to tell you, I think a lot of Jordan Leggett. I think he's really good at Clemson. But of the four guys there, the best player to me, athleticism, importance to his team, I think O.J. Howard's probably one of the best players in all of college football. I was surprised to see him fourth team, and I think O.J. Howard will mean more to Alabama's success in 2016.
Chad, your thoughts about, let's see, wide receiver. We got Ridley up there. We talked about Christian Kirk on the second team, tight end O.J. Howard for Alabama on the fourth team right now.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting Christian Kirk is in this list here. Shows a lot of respect towards him. It also shows that Steven thinks that obviously they're going to be able to get him the ball quite a bit to be in this group of wide receivers. Calvin Ridley, a guy that we were very familiar with. I think Stewart and some of the other guys are going to come up and show up this year. Again, you got to keep in mind there is an O.J. Howard there. We've been patiently waiting the last couple of years to see how they were going to work him into this offense, and so I'm curious to see how that happens when you've got a guy like Calvin Ridley who's only going to get better. That Amari Cooper type of wide receiver, Julio Jones type of guy, the guys that are just very elite, and that's what you have. And it's really interesting to me that Christian Kirk is in that conversation because he's been a guy that's been a special teams guy. His freshman year, he's very electric as far as his speed and explosiveness. But I'm curious to see how he carries that out across the football season as he plays a major role as a wide receiver. So it could be saying a lot here for Texas A&M, and maybe he's seeing a little something that we don't.
Let me open this up a little bit more and go through the offensive line. Then I'll let David speak to the offensive line and the wide receivers as well as Mike. Offensive line, obviously, a distinguishing quality of SEC power teams in recent years at LSU and Alabama in particular. Don't see a whole lot here from the offensive line outside of Cam Robinson from Alabama, of course. A lot from the other Power 5 as we sprinkle through here. And, of course, Ethan Posick from LSU on the second team. And, boy, that's pretty much it, David. It's a bit surprising to see the scarcity of offensive line. Right here on the Athlon's first four teams here.
Right. Dan Skipper from Arkansas in the chat can speak a lot more to him, but to me it's not too surprising to see an Arkansas offensive lineman with Bielema's recruiting regimen there. Cam Robinson, I guess, interesting just because he's been in the news lately with the off-the-field issues. I doubt that affects how he plays but does he miss some games because of this? Probably too early to say for right now. I don't know if Saban's really come out and said too much of what's going to happen there. If he misses some games, did that hurt his projection to be an All-American? I really doubt it. But he may, first game of the season, USC, he may have to miss that game. Go back to wide receiver. I didn't hit on that. The quick thing I'll just say about Calvin Ridley is, it's all about, also who plays quarterback for Alabama, Cooper Bateman and Blake Barnett, who gets the job there. And, Lane Kiffin has found a way, no matter who the quarterback is, to get the main playmaker the ball. We've seen it in the last 2 years, Blake Sims and Jake Coker last year. So it probably doesn't matter who the quarterback is, but if one of those guys aren't pressing the right buttons with Kiffin, does Ridley's numbers drop a little bit? I'd be interested to see that.
No, Mark, I just echo your comments about the concern on offensive line. Only 3 out of 20 of the offensive line All-Americans coming from the SEC. The SEC has always been a line of scrimmage conference. That is a little concerning for the conference as a whole. But what I will tell you is I think the offensive line is the hardest position to evaluate for a preseason All-American team. Look at the guys on that list, and they are the senior or they are the most senior upperclassmen on the teams that have the best running games. If you look at the running backs in the All-American list, and you look at the offensive linemen, Clemson, Alabama, Florida State, and Arkansas and LSU are great rushing teams. I think the offensive line is the hardest position to evaluate for a preseason, which is why I'm not too worried about the SEC only having 3 of 20. I think at the end of the season, the SEC will have 5 or 6 of those 20 positions on the All-American list.
So you talk offensive line play in the SEC. We can say the same in recent years, pretty much any decade. Defensive line play in the SEC and how dominant it's been. Jonathan Allen, the pass rushing specialist at Alabama, jumps in on the first team. Mizzou shows up. Charles Harris continues the excellent line play at Mizzou in recent years. Tennessee with Derek Barnett has had huge numbers in terms of sacks and tackles for loss in recent years. Arden Key for LSU, of course, they're always strong up front. And we're talking first and second team with these guys. Myles Garrett, freakish first 2 years at Texas A&M. Anybody else show up here? Florida with Jared Davis on the fourth team as well. So, David, take it away on that defensive front.
Well, the first thing is, I mean, Jared Davis is a linebacker. They even put it in parentheses, and they list him in the defensive line category. It seems like they really wanted to fit Jared Davis in there somewhere, but for some reason he's not in the linebacker grouping, even though there's 3 positions on the All-American team there. Made him a defensive lineman, so I'll back him up. He is a linebacker. He's an outside linebacker. Maybe he doesn't really rush on the outside edge all that much either. So it's kind of surprising why they have him as a defensive lineman category. I don't know. But yeah, Mark, you mentioned. I mean, yeah, Derek Barnett, Myles Garrett, and Jonathan Allen. I mean, yeah, give me those 3 right there, and I'll go to fight with anybody. And it's those guys, like you said, Barnett, Garrett. I mean, tackles for losses, sacks, guys in the just disrupting forces that we're used to seeing, carried over from Dante Fowler's and Jarvis Jones's of the world, and it just keeps going for the SEC, and it's no surprise that number is as deep as it is right there.
There's a dynamic that I think plays into this that's different than other sports. One is that because of the few games that are played, some guys, if they have a reputation coming into a program, maybe have a couple big games, maybe they even miss time or they really haven't been that outstanding yet, but there's anticipation and they find their way onto a team rather in the other sports where there's more games played and more of a track record that is usually asked of them before that they can appear on something like this. But because of the attrition of the sport in terms of injuries and because guys move on, obviously, there are some spots open, even though it's a national team, and you would think that there would be plenty of guys to choose from. I think some of these teams are sprinkled with guys that aren't really that proven, but they're at exceptional programs. A lot's expected, and maybe they had a couple games last season that showed that they're capable of something big. Chad, we're talking defense here, if anything stands out to you.
Yeah, I'm looking at the fact that Charles Harris out of Missouri, second team, kind of speaks to the fact that we know that Odom is going to be the guy that's going to come in as the head coach, kind of carry that blueprint from Missouri, and it's going to be defensive oriented. I really like the fact that we are seeing that. So it does. I would assume it gives some Missouri fans a little bit of hope that maybe they can squeeze out a couple games this season that maybe they weren't expected to. Another guy that I'm loving on this list is Jonathan Allen from Alabama. Just a guy you want to talk about, Barnett and Garrett as being disruptive forces, David. I think Jonathan Allen's one of those guys, too, that just comes in and he's just a monster. Another guy to watch out for that we're speaking about Alabama, he's not on this list. He's going to be a first-year guy, Tim Williams. This guy looks like an absolute monster, fellas, and he fits that mold of defensive end that Alabama's had in the past where he's just a big, explosive guy. But I do think that what we're seeing here is the respect for the SEC on the defensive side of the ball. You look at this, Arden Key at LSU, you turn around, and yes, I'm still kind of wondering how Jared Davis got in here, but regardless of the fact, he's there. But you see that there's a lot of respect here for that defensive side of the ball, and Mike had alluded to that before we started talking to Peter, that there's a lot more defensive guys from the SEC, and it's still prevalent that the SEC is going to hang its hat on its hard-crushing defense. And look at that, man. You got 3 guys right there from this conference that are on the first team. That's pretty nice, and I think that speaks volumes for the SEC.
So we look at linebacker, we look at DB, Mike, and Chad kind of hit on something there late that I think about here. I wonder how much pressure is placed on these magazines, or internally that they put pressure on themselves to kind of balance this thing out. I know that the SEC somewhat dominated. If we look at total numbers with 32, as we would expect, it's the best conference. I think that's largely the consensus. The ACC and the Big Ten jump in there after that at 23 and 22 behind the SEC's 32. But if there's a thought by the group compiling these lists and putting together these All-American teams that, hey, maybe it's skewed a little bit more than that, then let's rethink this and possibly even it out. The sales distribution is going to be maybe a little bit better if we even things out. I don't know if that thought process comes into it as well.
Well, there's a lot more people that buy magazines in Columbus and Los Angeles than there are in South Carolina. So maybe they do. I think what's probably harder for them is looking at the different systems. When you look at a guy, let's say on offense, you look at a running back who's really good, but he's in a Big 12 pass first offense. He might not have the numbers that an SEC running back has. But he's still really good. How do they? I think the hard part for the staff is balancing the player's individual performance and the player's individual ability against the system that he might be in. So to me, that's really probably the hardest thing they have to do. And then when they do have an unbalanced representation, they can always go back to that. If you're in the SEC and you're a defensive lineman, like we see five of the top 8. You're going to have a lot of tackles. You're going to have a lot of tackles for losses because there's more, the balance of run versus pass is higher towards the run, so you're going to have more opportunities to have more tackles as a defensive lineman and more tackles for losses. And just like I said, the offensive line's hard to evaluate. The defensive line's easy to evaluate because you got tackles, solo tackles, assistant tackles, tackles for losses, pass breakups, and fumble recoveries. You got like 6 stats you can use. So I think that's probably the hardest, not so much balancing out the conferences or the teams, because college football is a national brand, but balancing out the players against the systems they play in.
And that's a good point, because Calvin Ridley is not going to compile one of the 4 best wide receiver stat lines in 2016. I think we can agree upon that. There are going to be kids in the MAC, the Mountain West, and at some pass-happy schools in the Big 12 that are going to compile better stat lines. When I compile these lists for myself, whether it's a top 10 list or anything like that, or we get together and compile lists, I go with who I think are the best players, not necessarily are they going to compile the best statistics. And I'm glad to see Calvin Ridley, and of course Alabama is going to be given the nod to a certain degree. But looking at the best players, not necessarily the guys that are going to compile the best stats. If you go generic along the defensive front, though, I would say, Mike, since they're going defensive line and not separating the ends and the tackles, it's easy to go the ends route because they compile the glossier statistics with the tackles for loss and the sacks, rather than there could be some D tackles and the numbers aren't going to look crazy at the end of the year, but NFL scouts will tell you that guy's a man and he gets the job done in the middle and does the dirty work.
You're absolutely right, Mark. And the defensive tackle position is a lot like offensive line. That guy's value is blocking up the 1, the 2, the 3 holes and making sure that offensive line can't run effectively in the middle. The defensive end is responsible for the sacks and coming in and cleaning up what that defensive tackle blocks up in the middle. So the defensive tackle has the same problem as the offensive line. Very hard to evaluate. You actually have to go back and watch film, which is incredibly hard. Actually, it's not. But it's really hard to evaluate. So that's a great point. You see that defensive line is dominated by ends, outside guys, instead of the inside guys who do all the dirty work.
And I know it drives all of us crazy to different degrees in regards to maybe the legitimacy of the work done by some of these guys that compile these lists, and that's kind of what you're getting at, Mike. There have been some big faux pas in recent years from guys that are obviously given some credibility and able to vote for some of these All-American teams or get on some of these award lists, and they really don't know that much. Let me throw it out to you guys this way, and you can chime in with the guy that you think should be on here that's been omitted from the first 4 teams, Chad. Is there anybody that you think, hey, I'd like to see that guy, I think he's earned it, I think he's ready to explode, he should be on one of these teams? I know we talked Chad Kelly, but is there anybody else?
Yeah, when looking at this list, Mark, I mean, it's really kind of like you said at the very beginning, how do you really start to break these down? I mean, how do you go about putting this list together when it's on a national scope like this? Realistically, when I'm looking at it, it's really hard for me. I mean, you've got Ingram on here, you've got O.J. Howard, you've got a lot of guys. Kendall Beckwith makes the list. I mean, this is really like a lot of the who's who of the SEC on here, and it's really kind of hard for me to look for any other name maybe that I would add on here. I mean, even Zach Cunningham's getting some love from Vanderbilt, and that's just that's saying something there. It's really taking a look at the personnel that you're seeing across the SEC. Maybe I would throw some guys in from the SEC, but you got to remember we're biased in the aspect that this is the conference that we cover. And when we're looking at it from a national perspective, we may say, this guy really isn't that good. But, I have to sit back and watch more than just one game or watch more than a highlight of say, Malik McDowell. I need to see more of him to say, hey, I can without a doubt say that this guy is better than A and B. And so I think they did pretty good, guys. I mean, I'm not gonna knock it as far as, is there anybody on here that shouldn't be on here? I mean, sure, we could probably have that debate, but when we start thinking about the scope of the Power 5 teams and looking at these rosters and taking it down, I think they did a really good job.
Anything there, David, that sticks out to you that maybe from an omission standpoint?
Omission, no, but I just want to guess maybe get you guys' thought. I mean, I guess this could go into that, but is anybody surprised that it's the ACC that's in second with 23?
Well, the ACC, I don't believe, is the second best conference in college football, but does it have two teams that kind of trump the rest of the league? So out of those 22, I haven't done the count, but how many of them come from Florida State and from Clemson?
8 from Clemson and 4 from Florida State.
So 12 out of 22.
So 12 total.
12 teams are represented by 10 players.
We are biased toward the SEC, and if I wanted to throw Boom Williams in or something like that from Kentucky as an all-purpose guy, but he's probably, he's not one of the nation's best all-purpose guys, but that's just one, out of my head. He's probably one of the SEC's best, but I definitely wouldn't put him on the national list.
And you guys keep in mind, too, this list, overall selections-wise, the SEC had 32, ACC had 23, and Big Ten had 22. I think you still got a lot of respect and a lot of the tipping of the hat going towards the SEC when it's said and done.
Mark, I'll take up both of those issues real quick. As far as overlooked, I really think Dominique Sanders from Georgia should have been there at safety, and I can tell you where he can go. He can go on the fourth team in Tony Connor's spot. I like Tony Connor. I think he's a great guy. Had a great 2014 season, but he played in 5 games last year. He was injured twice, and in those 5 games, no interceptions, no sacks, and averaged about 3 tackles per game. I don't know. Again, I think he's a great guy. Had a good 2014 season, but I don't know why he is on an All-American team for 2016 after his 2015 campaign. We talked last week. Dominique Sanders had 6 interceptions, 5 tackles for loss, a sack, and was the dominant guy on the #1 pass defense in the country. I really think that merits a 4th-team All-American more than 5 games, no interceptions, no tackles, and 2 injuries. So I think he got overlooked. And then on David's point about the breakdown, here's one thing that does concern me about the SEC. Over 60% of all the SEC's All-Americans come from 3 teams on this list. The SEC has always branded itself as the best conference from top to bottom, the best conference overall, saying our number 10 team could beat your number 4 team. I think we're starting to see the conference get a little bit top-heavy. I think you're going to see Vanderbilt go back down to where it historically has. I think you're going to see Mississippi State regress. South Carolina has clearly regressed in the last couple of years. Kentucky hasn't moved forward. And now, so if you look at Alabama, LSU, and Tennessee, those 3 teams represent over 60% of the preseason All-Americans. If it looks that way at the end of the season, the composition of the SEC as the best conference from top to bottom might be in jeopardy.
The first point you made there, Mike, in regards to who were the best players in 2015 and who earned 2016 All-America status, it depends on how you're putting your team together. Are you rewarding the guys that you thought were the best in 2015, or are you making a projection that these are going to be the best players for 2016? And that's where I would defend the selection of Connor. Somebody saying Dominique Sanders, was the better player because he was on the field last year, but I'm projecting Connor to have a better year in 2016.
I'm projecting, but I'm projecting based on the player's performance from 2015. People forget Tony Connors still played in 5 games last year. And in those 5, it's not that he had less numbers because he played in fewer games. He had less numbers per game. In the 5 games he did play in, he didn't produce really anything. 3 tackles a game average, that's it.
That in a sense, we can't argue any of this because none of it's played out. We're only projecting as well. So we could say Josh Dobbs. Somebody could say anybody. Give me Brandon Harris. I think Brandon Harris is going to be the best quarterback in the country this year. Well, that sounds ludicrous, but it has yet to be proven. So I could say I'm going to put him on my first team because I believe he's going to be the best quarterback in the country this year. Again, I think that's ludicrous because I think it's a combination, but it's still a projection, not just who were the best last year that didn't go to the NFL, and boom, they're on my 4 teams.
Yeah, I thought about Dominic Sanders earlier, so I definitely have to second Michael on that. It fell off my mind, but I did before we even started today. I thought about he should probably be on this list, so I'll back up Michael on that too.
You notice where Jamal Adams was a little bit lower on our top 5 lists, or at least a couple of the top 5 lists, and he made the first team. Yep. Playing up to a point that Mike made earlier in regards to, and I did, in regards to giving a nod to the better teams and the better conferences, regardless of what the stats might come out to. It's interesting to note that I believe only one group of 5 player made the traditional offense and defensive teams, but if you go to special teams, 2 positions where you can accurately equate somebody's statistics regardless of who's in front of them. How far do you punt the football regardless of where you're playing? That can be measured. Or how accurate are you kicking field goals? There we see Memphis, Colorado State, San Jose State. Those 3 schools show up just in those 2 positions.
Yeah, I'm going to give Steven a hard time here because I know he's going to watch this. So Steven Lassen, who actually wrote the article, so I'm going to give him a hard time. And nice job. He went to collegefootballstats.com and found the top guys and put them in there. That's how this one wound out in special teams here. No, I think that you're right, Mark. I mean, because it's a cumulative. It's a lot easier to, I guess, it's easier to predict and project those type of positions when you got these guys that are pretty consistent. I mean, honestly, kickers and punters, very rarely see any contact, if any, so what they're going to be able to do. They're going to give you game for game. The one that I do think is a little scary to predict on here is the kick returner and the punt returner, because some of these guys can have some bust-out years. I mean, Evan Berry, in my opinion, does deserve it. He's one of the best, and he's proven that. That kickoff return against Arkansas that they ended up losing that game in Knoxville anyways, but that was, after seeing that, I thought that game was over. So, I mean, this guy's had multiple returns. Definitely somebody I'm really looking forward to seeing a lot more of, but that one is the position that kind of is a little bit trickier for me. I think it becomes a little bit more subjective, and, Antonio Callaway's in that conversation, Cam Sutton's in that conversation. These dudes could go off this year and have massive return yards and just blow it up. So I don't know. At the end of the year, I'd like to keep these and have this conversation and go back to it after the season's over, and we take a look at these actual lists and things and kind of see where guys actually landed.
Well, and we should collect this. I was just going to say we should collect this along with the AP and maybe the All-SEC teams preseason, and then see, okay, how accurate were these selections. Let me make one point, Mike, before I give it over to you, and that's going back to the offensive line. That's where it's very difficult, I think, to push somebody off the All-America list or an All-Conference list. If you've got a reputation coming into this season, let's say Cam Robinson plays, if we're talking about scouting and coaching and guys that look at the film, let's say he plays a first half of the season that's pretty average, not awful, but are people going to know that? Who's going to know that to say, you know what, Cam Robinson didn't really have that great of a season, but he came into it with a reputation as the best player, therefore he's still going to get All-America attention in the postseason. That's probably going to happen. Not to say he's not going to have a good season, but that happens more readily along the offensive line where we can't measure statistics and say that guy underachieved.
Mark, especially, that's a perfect example, especially for an offense that's going to run it 60 to 65% of the time, or if you look at Tennessee, if you have a mobile quarterback, or Ole Miss with Chad Kelly, if you have a mobile quarterback, that tackle is going to give up less sacks just simply because they either run in the ball or they have a mobile quarterback. But the question I was going to ask you is, to your point about the special teams and the G5 players and the special team, you were talking earlier about balancing out the All-American list as far as teams and conferences. Do you think these writers and voters use the special teams All-American slots to do that balancing out? Is it easier for the special teams players?
Well, I think it is, because you touched upon it, Chad touched upon it as well. If a kicker, I can't think of his name right now, but he's kicking in the NFL. He was at Tulane a few years ago, and he was a fairly high draft choice, like first 4 or 5 rounds, and he was perfect going into his senior season, so he was first-team All-American. That's pretty easy to measure. Sure, the argument could be made, is he kicking in pressure situations at the Swamp and at venues like that with big impact games? No, he's not. He's kicking at Tulane. But the numbers say he's perfect, so he's an All-American, versus this cornerback in the Mountain West picked off 9 passes. Well, would he do that in the SEC? Or this player at Western Michigan caught 100 passes last year. Would he do that in the SEC? He may not start. He may be the 4th wide receiver on an SEC team. So I do think I can't speculate on the approach here specifically, but I would think, yes, that those opportunities are taken to get guys like that to round out the selection process.
Mark, I want to back up what you said about how preseason reputation can kind of buy into a postseason the way that too. Florida last year to me was a perfect example. Vernon Hargreaves did not have the 2015 that many projected him have. That he had a lot better 2014, and Jalen Tabor on the other side of the field actually had a better season. But Hargreaves still received all the accolades of a first team. More than likely he deserved a little bit of it. But when your stats were not as good as the year before, and another guy on your team had better stats, but you still get the first team, I think a lot of that had to do with the reputation of Vernon Hargreaves more than it did his actual results.
We could really tear this apart, but we see, Daniel Carlson of Auburn showing up, and J.K. Scott as well, and we know how good those guys are, so that's well-deserved based on past performance as well. SEC Breakdown. So we got to remind everyone that we're on Twitter, throwing out a ton of good stuff each and every day throughout the off-season. And so please join us there, follow us there. Chad Niepling, David Waters, Mike LaValle. We're here every Wednesday night, release this thing on Thursday morning. And please throw out your topics. If you'd like to hear us discuss anything in particular, give us a shout on Twitter, and we will tackle anything involving SEC football. All right, until next time, we will see you for SEC Breakdown.